Hi everyone, thank you very much for stopping by and returning to the Old World. The release of the High Elves is just around the corner, and we're expecting models to be available for pre-order pretty soon. So I think it's a good time to have a bit of a recap about just what do we know so far. Let's start with the background. Well, Warhammer The Old World is set, oddly enough, in the region of the Warhammer world called the Old World. And that isn't the natural home of the High Elves. So the High Elves we're talking about, these aren't the High Elves of faraway Uthlan. This is the story of those residing in the enclaves, often bordering the realms of men and the islands just off the Old World. By this point in the history line of Warhammer, most High Elves have retreated away from the Old World, and this was following the infamous War of the Beard, a bitter war with the dwarves. Now, the latest Warhammer community article talks around this being a great defeat for the High Elves. However, I'm sure if you asked any self-respecting High Elf, were they to actually exist of course, they would probably see this more as a score draw. Yes, sure, the dwarves have now claimed dominion over the land, but the High Elves still control the sea lanes, and that is something that's really important to them, being able to have that control over potential trade routes, etc., and being able to move back as and when the desire takes them. As a side point, Games Workshop have made it quite clear they are not looking at the narrative around Uthlan. Because of its location, it takes it out of scope of the game, and they've been very clear, I think, throughout a lot of their articles over the last couple of years that the scope of Warhammer The Old World is being very much focused on the Old World. It's being focused on the Border Princes, and factions that are outside of that area are not going to be making an appearance. I mean, this is part of the reason why we're not seeing the Dark Elves, for example. Now, I do find this a little bit interesting because there's obviously this mysterious faction coming up, and the internet investigators have concluded it's almost certainly going to be Cathay. In a previous video, I talked around maybe Kislev being my preferred option for this slot, but if we go with the common consensus that we're looking at Cathay, I think it's going to be really interesting, given that they're saying Uthlan's too far away to really be driving narrative in this game, how they're going to plug Cathay in, as Cathay is also a huge distance away from the area of land we know as the Old World. This diversion aside, let's just touch base with the Arcane Journal for the High Elves. Well, I've commented previously in a video around the Arcane Journal. That was following the Las Vegas Open preview. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. Suffice to say, there's going to be the usual 2 armies of infamy, one of them for Chrace, I probably pronounced that wrong, and one of them for the Sea Guard. Now, the story that's going to appear in the Arcane Journal relates to a diplomat being captured by beastmen. And as an aside, I think that's quite an interesting choice, because not only are beastmen appearing in the Arcane Journal for High Elves, but they're also appearing in the Empire Arcane Journal that we saw at the start of the year. So both of the releases this year tie into a story regarding beastmen. So I do wonder if that means they're going to be next on the shopping list for Games Workshop to release. It would make sense. We've had 2 of the Forces of Order, so one of the more evil factions coming next would break that up, leaving us just the Wood Elves to come at some point during the year. Back to the High Elves, however, and a look into the future of Warhammer. So, Warhammer community have discussed that certain famous High Elves that veterans of the Warhammer Fantasy Battle games will doubtlessly recall, they're not generally going to be making an appearance in the story. It's time for new heroes to step up. Why? Well, the canon for these people is already written. We're not exploring any new ground with them. And with the exception of Carhel, who is included in the current releases, they're off doing other things. So it's time for other characters to step forward and have their stories told. Now, within talking around this, there is a hint from Games Workshop around some of its thinking going forward. it talks around moving the time frame. Now, many people, myself included, may well think actually some campaign books moving the time frame forward, introducing different campaigns, perhaps the way they used to, such as the Old Grudge of Drong and things like those books. That would be really interesting. We could start to explore the forces of chaos moving south, the great incursion against chaos, particularly if it's not Cathay that's coming down the tracks, but is actually Kislev. The Warhammer community article says, yes, there might be some movement in the future, but basically they are in absolutely no rush to do that. So personally, I wouldn't expect to see anything in the near future or any real developments when it comes to driving the narrative in different directions, certainly when it changes the timescale covered by the game. So no chaos incursion for us. A final comment from me really is regarding models, and particularly one model that I haven't spoken about in a previous video, and that is the Merworm. Now, this is a returning beastie and is a watery cousin of the noble dragon, but it has a very different style to the clean lines we expect of the dragons we normally associate with the High Elves. In fact, the High Elves themselves tend to be very sleek, very clean-cut lines, etc. of their models. So I think this figure is really going to stand out, and I'm not necessarily sure it's going to stand out in a good, positive way. Now, don't get me wrong. When it comes to the Merworm and the pictures we've seen on the internet, I think this looks like a really interesting figure. It looks really nice, but I can sit more within the bestiaries of the Dark Elves than I can fitting in stylistically, aesthetically with the High Elves. As for its rules, well, we don't know tons at the moment, but we do know that it's getting 4 attacks at weapon skill and strength 6. We know that it's going to have a rule that says range attacks, shooting it at long range, suffer a -2 to hit rather than a -1. Now, this is interesting up to a point, but I'm not sure it has a massive practical value. Why? Well, if you're shooting at a big beastie at long range, are you going to be firing small arms fire at it? Particularly if we're looking at something that's strength 6, it's almost certainly going to be toughness 5, toughness 6. Small arms fires, they're going to be wounding on a 6. Long range, so -1 to hit becomes -2 to hit. It's not a great target, even before that extra -1 to hit comes into play. You're more likely to be hitting it with spells and artillery, things that don't actually roll to hit in the first place, certainly not in the conventional manner of needing a certain score on a d6. So I'm not sure that rule will actually come into play all that often. The other rule it's got is models in base to base will have -1 to their strength when fighting close combat. This is probably more interesting, it's more useful, I think, for the Merworm, because let's face it, it's coming back to my guess that we're looking at a high toughness creature. You're probably going to be needing characters or great weapons, etc., to line up against it. And those figures in base to base, again, you'll want the characters there because then they can use all of their attacks, not just the one attack for being in the fighting rank. So that pip of strength going off suddenly can become quite significant, and anything that turns a 4 to wound into a 5 to wound, etc., or a 5 into a 6 is going to be really useful for keeping this thing alive and on the table. Choppy Lord just isn't going to be as choppy when it comes to fighting this beastie. So there we have a bit of a roundup of the latest information and touching on a couple of the bits and pieces that I've discussed in the past or not had enough material to form a video of their own. It's great to see progress being made. It's going to be good to see different types of High Elf on the field, and hopefully we'll see more High Elves on the field. I think they are lovely models generally. A well-painted High Elf army is a thing to behold, just not one I'm going to be diving into personally. What are your thoughts on the information that's being provided to us by Warhammer community? Are you interested, intrigued? Do let me know down in the comments below. All that remains for me to say once more is thank you very much for listening. I am returned to the old world. Have a great day.